2010 Odyssey Two by Arthur C. Clarke. Chapter 3 Discovery, Part 12 Downhill Run. The ship was gaining speed at last on the downhill run toward Jupiter. It had long since passed the gravitational no man's land, where the four tiny outer moons, Sinope, Pasiphae, Ananke, and Carme, wobbled along their retrograde and wildly eccentric orbits. Undoubtedly captured asteroids and completely irregular in shape. The largest was only 30 kilometers across. Jagged, splintered rocks of no interest to anyone except planetary geologists. Their allegiance wavered continually between the Sun and Jupiter. One day, the Sun would recapture them completely. But Jupiter might retain the second group of four, at half the distance of the others: Ilera, Lysithea, Himalaya, and Leda were fairly close together and lying in almost the same plane. There was speculation that they had once been part of a single body. If so, the parent would have been barely 100 kilometers across. Though only Carme and Leda came close enough to show discs visible to the naked eye, they were greeted like old friends. Here was the first landfall after the longest ocean voyage, the offshore islands of Jupiter. The last hours were ticking away. The most critical phase of the entire mission was approaching: the entry into the Jovian atmosphere. Jupiter was already larger than the moon in the skies of Earth, and the giant inner satellites could be clearly seen moving around it. They all showed noticeable disk and distinctive coloring, though they were still too far away for any markings to be visible. The eternal ballet they performed, disappearing behind Jupiter, reappearing to transit the daylight face with their accompanying shadows, was an endlessly engaging spectacle. It was one that astronomers had watched ever since Galileo had first glimpsed it almost exactly 4 centuries ago. But the crew of Leonine were the only living men and women to have seen it with unaided eyes. The interminable chess games had ceased. Off-duty hours were spent at the telescopes or in earnest conversation or listening to music, usually while gazing at the view outside. And at least one shipboard romance had reached a culmination: the frequent disappearance of Max Brelovsky and Xenia Marchenko was the subject of much good-natured banter. They were, thought Floyd, an oddly matched pair. Max was a big, handsome blonde who had been a champion gymnast, reaching the finals of the 2000 Olympics. Though he was in his early 30s, he had an open-faced, almost boyish expression. This was not altogether misleading. Despite his brilliant engineering record, he often struck Floyd as naive and unsophisticated, one of those people who are pleasant to talk to, but not for too long. Outside his own field of undoubted expertise, he was engaging, but rather shallow. Xenia, at 29, the youngest on board, was still something of a mystery. Since no one wished to talk about it, Floyd had never raised the subject of her injuries, and his Washington sources could provide no information. Obviously, she had been involved in some serious accident, but it might have been nothing more unusual than a car crash. The theory that she had been on a secret space mission, still part of popular mythology outside the USSR, could be ruled out. Thanks to the global tracking networks, no such thing had been possible for 50 years. In addition to her physical and doubtless psychological scars, Zinnia labored under yet another handicap. She was a last minute replacement, and everyone knew it. Irina Yakunina was to have been dietitian and medical assistant aboard Leonov before that unfortunate argument with a glider broke too many bones. Every day at 1800 GMT, the crew of 7 plus 1 passenger gathered in the tiny common room that separated the flight deck from the galley and sleeping quarters. The circular table at its center was just big enough for 8 people to squeeze around. When Chandra and Cornell were revived, it would be unable to accommodate everyone, and 2 extra seats would have to be fitted in somewhere else. Though the 6 o'clock Soviet, as the daily roundtable conference was called, seldom lasted more than 10 minutes, it played a vital role in maintaining morale. Complaints, suggestions, criticisms, progress reports, anything could be raised, subject only to the captain's overriding veto, which was very seldom exercised. Typical items on the non existent agenda were requests for changes in the menu, appeals for more private communication time with Earth, suggested movie programs, exchange of news and gossip, and good natured needling of the heavily outnumbered American contingent. Things would change, Floyd warned them, when his colleagues came out of hibernation and the odds improved from 1 in 7 to 3 in 9. He did not mention his private belief that Colonel could outtalk or outshout any 3 other people on board or aboard. When he was not sleeping, much of Floyd's own time was spent in the common room, partly because, despite its smallness, it was much less claustrophobic than his own tiny cubicle. It was also cheerfully decorated, all available flat surfaces being covered with photos of beautiful land and seascapes, sporting events, portraits of popular video stars, and other reminders of Earth. Pride of place, however, was given to an original Leonov painting, his 1965 study near the moon, made in the same year when, as a young lieutenant colonel, he left Voskhod II and became the first man in history to perform an extravehicular excursion. Clearly the work of a talented amateur rather than a professional, it showed the cratered edge of the moon with the beautiful sinus iridium bay of rainbows in the foreground. Looming monstrously above the lunar horizon was the thin crescent of Earth, embracing the darkened night side of the planet. Beyond that blazed the sun, the streamers of the corona reaching out into space for millions of kilometers around it. It was a striking composition, and a glimpse of the future that even then lay only 3 years ahead. On the flight of Apollo 8, Anders, Borman, and Lovell were to see the splendid sight with their unaided eyes as they watched Earth rise above the far side on Christmas Day, 1968. Haywood Floyd admired the painting, but he also regarded it with mixed feelings. He could not forget that it was older than everybody else on the ship, with one exception. He was already 9 years old when Alexei Leonov had painted it. Part 13. The Worlds of Galileo. Even now, more than 3 decades after the revelation of the first Voyager flybys, no one really understood why the four giant satellites differed so wildly from one another. They were all about the same size and in the same part of the solar system, yet they were totally dissimilar, as if children of a different birth. Only Callisto, the outermost, had turned out to be much as expected. When Leonov raced past at a distance of just over 100,000 kilometers, the larger of its countless craters was clearly visible to the naked eye. Through the telescope, the satellite looked like a glass ball that had been used as a target by high-powered rifles. It was completely covered with craters of every size, right down to the lower limit of visibility. Callisto, someone had once remarked, looked more like Earth's moon than did the moon itself. Nor was this particularly surprising. One would have expected a world out here at the edge of the asteroid belt to have been bombarded with the debris left over from the creation of the solar system. Yet Ganymede, the satellite next door, had a totally different appearance. Though it had been well peppered with impact craters in the remote past, most of them had been plowed over, a phrase that seemed peculiarly appropriate. Huge areas of Ganymede were covered with ridges and furrows, as if some cosmic gardener had dragged a giant rake across them. And there were light-colored streaks, like trails that might have been made by slugs 50 kilometers across. Most mysterious of all were long, meandering bands containing dozens of parallel lines. It was Nikolai Ternovsky who decided what they must be: multi-lane superhighways laid out by drunken surveyors. He even claimed to have detected overpasses and cloverleaf intersections. Leonov had added some trillions of bits of information about Ganymede to the store of human knowledge before it crossed the orbit of Europa. That ice-bound world, with its derelict and its dead, was on the other side of Jupiter, but it was never far from anyone's thoughts. Back on Earth, Dr. Chang was already a hero, and his countrymen had, with obvious embarrassment, acknowledged countless messages of sympathy. One had been sent in the name of the Leonov's crew. After Floyd gathered considerable redrafting in Moscow, the feeling on board the ship was ambiguous, a mixture of admiration, regret, and relief. All astronauts, irrespective of their national origins, regarded themselves as citizens of space and felt a common bond, sharing each other's triumphs and tragedies. No one on Leonov was happy because the Chinese expedition had met with disaster, yet at the same time there was a muted sense of relief that the race had not gone to the swiftest. The unexpected discovery of life on Europa had added a new element to the situation, one that was now being argued at great length both on Earth and aboard Leonov. Some exobiologists cried, "I told you so," pointing out that it should not have been such a surprise after all. As far back as the 1970s, research submarines had found teeming colonies of strange marine creatures thriving precariously in an environment thought to be equally hostile to life: the trenches on the bed of the Pacific. Volcanic springs, fertilizing and warming the abyss, had created oases in the deserts of the deep. Anything that had happened once on Earth should be expected millions of times elsewhere in the universe. That was almost an article of faith among scientists. Water, or at least ice, occurred on all the moons of Jupiter, and there were continuously erupting volcanoes on Io, so it was reasonable to expect weaker activity on the world next door. Putting these two facts together made European life seem not only possible, but inevitable, as most of nature's surprises are when viewed with 20/20 hindsight. Yet that conclusion raised another question, and one vital to Leonov's mission. Now that life had been discovered on the moons of Jupiter, did it have any connection with the Tycho monolith and the still more mysterious artifact in orbit around Io? That was a favorite subject to debate in the 6 o'clock Soviets. It was generally agreed that the creature encountered by Dr. Chang did not represent a high form of intelligence, at least if his interpretation of its behavior was correct. No animal with even elementary powers of reasoning would have allowed itself to become a victim of its instincts, attracted like a moth to the candle until it risked destruction. Vasily Orlov was quick to give a counterexample that weakened, if it did not refute that argument. Look at whales and dolphins, he said. We call them intelligent, but how often they kill themselves in mass strandings. That looks like a case where instinct overpowers reason. No need to go to the dolphins, interjected Max Brelovsky. One of the brightest engineers in my class was fatally attracted to a blonde in Kiev. When I heard of him last, he was working in a garage, and he'd won a gold medal for designing space stations. What a waste. Even if Dr. Chang's European was intelligent, that, of course, did not rule out higher forms elsewhere. The biology of a world could not be judged from a single specimen. But it had been widely argued that advanced intelligence could never arise in the sea. There were not enough challenges in so benign and unvarying an environment. Above all, how could marine creatures ever develop a technology without the aid of fire? Yet perhaps even that was possible. The route that humanity had taken was not the only one. There might be whole civilizations in the seas of other worlds. Still, it seemed unlikely that a spacefaring culture could have arisen on Europa without leaving unmistakable signs of its existence in the form of buildings, scientific installations, launching sites, or other artifacts. But from pole to pole, nothing could be seen but level ice and a few outcroppings of bare rock. No time remained for speculation and discussions when Leonov hurtled past the orbits of Io and tiny Mimas. The crew was busy almost non-stop, preparing for the encounter and the brief onset of weight after months in freefall. All loose objects had to be secured before the ship entered Jupiter's atmosphere. And the drag of deceleration produced momentary peaks that might be as high as 2 gravities. Floyd was lucky. He alone had time to admire the superb spectacle of the approaching planet, now filling almost half the sky. Because there was nothing to give it scale, there was no way that the mind could grasp its real size. He had to keep telling himself that 50 Earths would not cover the hemisphere now turned toward him. The clouds, colorful as the most garish sunset on Earth, raced so swiftly that he could see appreciable movement in as little as 10 minutes. Great eddies were continually forming along the dozen or so bands that girdled the planet, then rippling away like swirls of smoke. Plumes of white gas occasionally geysered up from the depths, to be swept away by the gales caused by the planet's tremendous spin. And perhaps strangest of all were the white spots, sometimes spaced as regularly as pearls on a necklace, which lay along the trade winds of the middle Jovian latitudes. In the hours immediately before encounter, Floyd saw little of captain or navigator. The Orloffs scarcely left the bridge, as they continually checked the approach orbit and made minute refinements to Leonov's course. The ship was now on the critical path that would just graze the outer atmosphere. If it went too high, frictional braking would not be sufficient to slow it down, and it would go racing out of the solar system beyond all possibility of rescue. If it went too low, it would burn up like a meteor. Between the two extremes lay little margin for error. The Chinese had proved that aerobraking could be done, but there was always the chance that something would go wrong. So Floyd was not at all surprised when Surgeon Commander Rudinko admitted, just an hour before contact, "I'm beginning to wish, Woody, that I had brought along that icon after all." Part 14, Double Encounter. Papers for the mortgage on the Nantucket house should be in the file marked M in the library. Well, that's all the business I can think of. For the last couple of hours, I've been recalling a picture I saw as a boy. In a tattered volume of Victorian art, it must have been almost 150 years old. I can't remember whether it was black or white or color, but I'll never forget the title. Don't laugh. It was called The Last Message Home. Our great-great-grandfathers loved that kind of sentimental melodrama. It shows the deck of a windjammer in a hurricane. The sails have been ripped away and the deck's awash. In the background, the crew is struggling to save the ship. And in the foreground, a young sailor boy's writing a note, while beside him is the bottle he hopes will carry it to land. Even though I was a kid at the time, I felt he should have been giving his shipmates a hand, not writing letters. All the same, it moved me. I never thought that one day I'd be like that young sailor. Of course, I'm sure you'll get this message, and there's nothing I can do to help aboard Leonov. In fact, I've been politely requested to keep out of the way, so my conscience is quite clear as I dictate this. I'll send it up to the bridge now because in 15 minutes, we'll break transmission as we pull in the big dish and batten down the hatches. There's another nice maritime analogy for you. Jupiter's filling the sky now. I won't attempt to describe it and won't even see it much longer because the shutters will go up in a few minutes. Anyway, the cameras can do far better than I could. Goodbye, my dearest, and my love to you all, especially Chris. By the time you get this, it will be over, one way or the other. Remember, I tried to do my best for all our sakes. Goodbye. When he removed the audio chip, Floyd drifted up to the communication center and handed it over to Sasha Kovalev. Please make sure it gets off before we close down, he said earnestly. Don't worry, promised Sasha. I'm still working on all channels, and we have a good 10 minutes left. He held out his hand. If we do meet again, why, we shall smile. If not, why, then this parting was well made. Floyd blinked. Shakespeare, I suppose? Of course, Brutus and Cassius before the battle. See you later. Tanya and Vasily were too intent upon their situation displays to do more than wave to Floyd, and he retreated to his cabin. He had already said farewell to the rest of the crew. There was nothing to do but wait. His sleeping bag was slung in preparation for the return of gravity when deceleration commenced, and he had only to climb into it. Antennas retracted, all protective shields up, said the intercom speaker. We should fill first braking in 5 minutes. Everything normal. That's hardly the word I'd use, Floyd muttered to himself. I think you mean nominal. He had barely concluded the thought when there was a different knock on the door. Katutam? To his astonishment, it was Xenia. Do you mind if I come in? She asked awkwardly in a small girl voice, which Floyd could scarcely recognize. Of course not. But why aren't you in your own cubicle? It's only 5 minutes to re-entry. Even as he asked the question, he was aware of its foolishness. The answer was so perfectly obvious that Xenia did not deign to reply. But Xenia was the very last person he would have expected. Her attitude toward him had invariably been polite but distant. Indeed, she was the only member of the crew who preferred to call him Dr. Floyd. Yet here she was, clearly seeking comfort and companionship at the moment of peril. Xenia, my dear, he said wryly. You're welcome, but my accommodation is somewhat limited. One might even call it Spartan. She managed a faint smile, but said nothing as she floated into the room. For the first time, Floyd realized that she was not merely nervous. She was terrified. Then he understood why she had come to him. She was ashamed to face her countrymen and was looking for support elsewhere. With this realization, his pleasure at the unexpected encounter abated somewhat. That did not lessen his responsibility to another lonely human being, a long way from home. The fact that she was an attractive, though certainly not beautiful woman of barely half his own age, should not have affected the issue. But it did. He was beginning to rise to the occasion. She must have noticed, but did nothing to encourage or discourage him as they lay down side by side in the sleeping cocoon. There was just enough room for them both. And Floyd began to do some anxious calculations. Suppose maximum G was higher than predicted, and the suspension gave way. They could easily be killed. There was an ample safety margin, no need to worry about such an ignominious end. Humor was the enemy of desire. Their embrace was now completely chaste. He was not sure whether to be glad or sorry. And it was too late for second thoughts. Far, far away came the first faint whisper of sound, like the wailing of some lost soul. At the same moment, the ship gave a barely perceptible jerk. The cocoon began to swing around and its suspension tightened. After weeks of weightlessness, gravity was returning. Within seconds, the fair whale had risen to a steady roar, and the cocoon had become an overloaded hammock. This is not such a good idea, Floyd thought to himself. Already it was difficult to breathe. The deceleration was only a part of the problem. Xenia was clutching him as a drowning person is supposed to clutch the proverbial straw. He detached her as gently as he could. It's all right, Xenia. If Shin did it, so can we. Relax, don't worry. It was difficult to shout tenderly, and he was not even sure if Xenia heard him above the roar of incandescent hydrogen. But she was no longer clutching him quite so desperately, and he seized the opportunity to take a few deep breaths. What would Caroline think if she could see him now? Would he tell her if he ever had the chance? He was not sure she would understand. At a moment like this, all links with Earth seemed very tenuous indeed. It was impossible to move or to speak, but now that he had grown accustomed to the strange sense of weight, he was no longer uncomfortable, except for the increasing numbness in his right arm. With some difficulty, he managed to extricate it from beneath Xenia. The familiar act brought a fleeting sense of guilt. As he felt his circulation returning, Floyd remembered a famous remark attributed to at least a dozen astronauts and cosmonauts. Both the pleasures and problems of zero-gravity sex have been greatly exaggerated. He wondered how the rest of the crew was faring, and he gave a momentary thought to Chandra and Cornell sleeping peacefully through it all. They would never know if Leonov became a meteor shower in the Jovian sky. He did not envy them. They had missed the experience of a lifetime. Tanya was speaking over the intercom. Her words were lost in the roar, but her voice sounded calm and perfectly normal. Just as if she was making a routine announcement. Floyd managed to glance at his watch and was astonished to see that they were already at the midpoint of the braking maneuver. At that very moment, Leonov was at its closest approach to Jupiter. Only expendable automatic probes had gone deeper into the Jovian atmosphere. Halfway through, Xenia, he shouted, on the way out again. He could not tell if she understood. Her eyes were tightly closed, but she smiled slightly. The ship was now rocking noticeably, like a small boat in a choppy sea. Was that normal? Wondered Floyd. He was glad that he had Xenia to worry about. It took his mind away from his own fears. Just for a moment, before he managed to expel the thought, he had a vision of the walls suddenly glowing cherry red and caving in upon him, like the nightmare fantasy of Edgar Allan Poe's The Pit and the Pendulum, which he'd forgotten for 30 years. But that would never happen. If the heat shield failed, the ship would crumble instantly, hampered flat by a solid wall of gas. There would be no pain. His nervous system would not have time to react before it ceased to exist. He had experienced more consoling thoughts, but this one was not to be despised. The buffeting slowly weakened. There was another inaudible announcement from Tanya. He would pull her leg about that when it was all over. Now time seemed to be going much more slowly. After a while, he stopped looking at his watch because he could not believe it. The digits changed so slowly that he could almost imagine himself in some Einsteinian time dilation. And then something even more unbelievable happened. First, he was amused, then slightly indignant. Xenia had fallen asleep. If not exactly in his arms, then at least beside them. It was a natural reaction. The strain must have exhausted her, and the wisdom of the body had come to her rescue. And suddenly, Floyd himself became aware of an almost post orgasmic drowsiness, as if he too had been emotionally drained by the encounter. He had to fight to remain awake. And then he was falling, falling, falling. It was all over. The ship was back in space, where it belonged, and he and Xenia were floating apart. They would never again be so close together, but they would always know a special tenderness toward one another, which no one else could ever share. Part 15. Escape from the Giant. When Floyd reached the observation deck, a discreet few minutes after Xenia, Jupiter already seemed farther away. But that must be an illusion based on his knowledge, not the evidence of his eyes. They had barely emerged from the Jovian atmosphere, and the planet still filled half the sky. And now they were, as intended, its prisoners. During the last incandescent hour, they had deliberately jettisoned the excess speed that could have carried them right out of the solar system and on to the stars. Now they were traveling in an ellipse, a classical whole-man orbit, which would shuttle them back between Jupiter and the orbit of Io. 350,000 kilometers higher. If they did not or could not fire their motors again, Leonov would swing back and forth between these limits, completing one revolution every 19 hours. It would become the closest of Jupiter's moons, though not for long. Each time it grazed the atmosphere, it would lose altitude until it spiraled into destruction. Floyd had never really enjoyed vodka, but he joined the others without any reservation in drinking a triumphant toast to the ship's designers, coupled with a vote of thanks to Sir Isaac Newton. Then Tanya put the bottle firmly back in its cupboard. There was still much to be done. Though they were all expecting it, everyone jumped at the sudden muffled thud of explosive charges and the jolt of separation. A few seconds later, a large, still glowing disk floated into view, slowly turning end over end as it drifted away from the ship. "Look," cried Max, "a flying saucer. Who's got a camera?" There was a distinct note of hysterical relief in the laughter that followed. It was interrupted by the captain in a more serious vein. "Goodbye, fateful heat shield. You did a wonderful job." "But what a waste," said Sasha. "There is at least a couple of tons left. Think of all the extra payload we could have carried." "If that's good, conservative Russian engineering," retorted Floyd, "then I'm all for it. Far better a few tons too much than 1 milligram too little." Everyone applauded those noble sentiments after the jettisoned shield cooled to yellow, then red, and finally became as black as the space around it. It vanished from sight while only a few kilometers away, though occasionally the sudden reappearance of an eclipsed star would betray its presence. Preliminary orbit checked complete. said Vasily. "We're within 10 meters a second of our right vector. Not bad for a first try." There was a subdued sigh of relief at the news, and a few minutes later, Vasily made another announcement. "Changing attitude for course correction, delta V 6 meters a second, 20-second burn, coming up in 1 minute." They were still so close to Jupiter, it was impossible to believe that the ship was orbiting the planet. They might have been in a high-flying aircraft that had just emerged from a sea of clouds. There was no sense of scale. It was easy to imagine that they were speeding away from some terrestrial sunset. The reds and pinks and crimsons sliding below were so familiar. And that was an illusion. Nothing here had any parallels with Earth. Those colors were intrinsic, not borrowed from the setting sun. The very gases were utterly alien, methane and ammonia, and a witch's brew of hydrocarbons, stirred in a hydrocarbon helium cauldron, but not one trace of free oxygen, the breath of human life. The clouds marched from horizon to horizon in parallel rows, distorted by occasional swirls and eddies. Here and there, upwellings of brighter gas broke the pattern, and Floyd could also see the dark rim of a great whirlpool, a maelstrom of gas leading down into unfathomable Jovian depths. He began to look for the great red spot, then quickly checked himself at such a foolish thought. All the enormous cloudscape he could see below would be only a few % of the red spot's immensity. One might as well expect to recognize the shape of the United States from a small airplane flying low above Kansas. Correction completed. We're now on interception orbit with Io. Arrival time, 8 hours, 55 minutes. Less than 9 hours to climb up from Jupiter and meet whatever is waiting for us, thought Floyd. We've escaped from the giant, but he represents a danger we understood and could prepare for. What lies ahead now is utter mystery, and when we have survived that challenge, we must return to Jupiter once again. We shall need his strength to send us safely home. Part 16, Private Line. Hello, Dimitri. This is Woody. Switching to key 2 in 15 seconds. Hello, Dimitri. Multiply keys 3 and 4, take cube root, add pi, squared, and use nearest integer as key 5. Unless your computers are a million times faster than ours, and I'm damn sure they're not, no one can decrypt this on your side or mine. But you may have some explaining to do. Anyway, you're good at that. By the way, my usual excellent sources told me about the failure of the latest attempt to persuade old Andre to resign. I gather that your delegation had no more luck than the others, and you're still saddled with him as president. I'm laughing my head off. It serves the Academy right. I know he's over 90 and growing a bit, well, stubborn. But you won't get any help from me, even though I'm the solar system's leading expert on the painless removal of elderly scientists. Would you believe that I'm still slightly drunk? We felt we deserved a little party once we'd successfully rendezvoused with Discovery. Besides, we had 2 new crew members to welcome aboard. Chandra doesn't believe in alcohol. It makes you too human. but Walter Curnow more than made up for him. Only Tanya remained stone cold sober, just as you'd expect. My fellow Americans, I sound like a politician, God help me, came out of hibernation without any problems, and are both looking forward to starting work. We'll all have to move quickly. Not only is time running out, but Discovery seems to be in very bad shape. We could hardly believe our eyes when we saw how its spotless white hull had turned a sickly yellow. Io's to blame, of course. The ships spiraled down to within 3,000 kilometers, and every few days one of the volcanoes blasts a few megatons of sulfur up into the sky. Even though you've seen the movies, you can't really imagine what it's like to hang above that inferno. I'll be glad when we can get away, even though we'll be heading for something much more mysterious and perhaps far more dangerous. I flew over Kilauea during the '06 eruption. That was mighty scary, but it was nothing compared to this. At the moment, we're over the night side, and that makes it worse. You can see just enough to imagine that a lot more. It's as close to hell as I ever want to get. Some of the sulfur lakes are hot enough to glow, but most of the light comes from the electrical discharges. Every few minutes, the whole landscape seems to explode as if a giant photo flash has gone off above it. And that's probably not a bad analogy. There are millions of amps flowing in the flux tube linking Io and Jupiter, and every so often there's a breakdown. Then you get the biggest lightning flash in the solar system, and have our circuit breakers jump out in sympathy. There's just been an eruption right on the terminator, and I can see a huge cloud expanding up toward us, climbing into the sunlight. I doubt if it will reach our altitude, and even if it does, it will be harmless by the time it gets here. But it looks ominous, a space monster trying to devour us. Soon after we got here, I realized that Io reminded me of something. It took me a couple of days to work it out, and then I had to check with mission archives because the ship's library couldn't help. Shame on it. Do you remember how I introduced you to The Lord of the Rings when we were kids back at that Oxford conference? Well, Io is Mordor. Look up part 3. There is a passage about rivers of molten rock that wound their way until they cooled and lay like twisted dragon shapes vomited from the tormented earth. That's a perfect description. How did Tolkien know a quarter century before anyone ever saw a picture of Io? Talk about nature imitating art. At least we won't have to land there. I don't think that even our late Chinese colleagues would have attempted that. But perhaps one day it may be possible. There are areas that seem fairly stable and not continually inundated by sulfur floods. Who would have believed that we'd come all the way to Jupiter, greatest of planets, and then ignore it? Yet that's what we're doing most of the time. And when we're not looking at Io or Discovery, we're thinking about the artifact. It's still 10,000 kilometers away, up there at the libration point, but when I look at it through the main telescope, it seems close enough to touch. Because it's so completely featureless, there's no indication of size, no way the eye can judge it's really a couple of kilometers long, And it's solid? It must weigh billions of tons. But is it solid? It gives almost no radar echo. Even when it's square onto us, we can see it only as a black silhouette against the clouds of Jupiter, 300,000 kilometers away. Apart from its size, it looks exactly like the monolith we dug up on the moon. Well, tomorrow we'll go aboard Discovery, and I don't know when I'll have time or opportunity to speak to you again. But there's one more thing, old friend, before I sign off. It's Caroline. She's never really understood why I had to leave Earth. And in a way, I don't think she'll ever quite forgive me. Some women believe that love isn't the only thing, but everything. Perhaps they're right. Anyway, it's certainly too late to argue now. Try and cheer her up when you have a chance. She talks about going back to the mainland. I'm afraid that if she does, if you can't get through to her, try to cheer up Chris. I miss him more than I care to say. He'll believe Uncle Dmitri if you say that his father still loves him and will be coming home just as quickly as he can. Part 17. Boarding Party. Even in the best of circumstances, it is not easy to board a derelict and uncooperative spaceship. Indeed, it can be positively dangerous. Walter Curnow knew that as an abstract principle, but he did not really feel it in his bones until he saw the entire 100-meter length of Discovery turning end over end while Leonov kept at a safe distance. Years ago, friction had braked the spin of Discovery's carousel, thus transferring its angular momentum to the rest of the structure. Now, like a drum majorette's baton, at the height of its trajectory, the abandoned ship was slowly tumbling along its orbit. The first problem was to stop that spin, which made Discovery not only uncontrollable, but almost unapproachable. As he suited up in the airlock with Max Brailovsky, Curnow had a very rare sensation of incompetence, even inferiority. It was not his line of business. He had already explained gloomily, I'm a space engineer, not a space monkey. But the job had to be done. He alone possessed the skills that could save Discovery from Io's grasp. Max and his colleagues, working with unfamiliar circuit diagrams and equipment, would take far too long. By the time they had restored power to the ship and mastered its controls, it would have plunged into the sulphurous fire pits below. You're not scared, are you? Asked Max when they were about to put on their helmets. Not enough to make a mess in my suit. Otherwise, yes. Max chuckled. I'd say that's about right for this job, but don't worry. I'll get you there in one piece and with my, what do you call it? Broomstick? Because witches are supposed to ride them. Oh, yes. Have you ever used one? I tried once, but mine got away from me. Everyone else thought it was very funny. There are some professions which have evolved unique and characteristic tools. The longshoreman's hook, the potter's wheel, the bricklayer's trowel, the geologist's hammer. The men who had to spend much of their time on zero-gravity construction projects had developed the broomstick. It was very simple, a hollow tube just a meter long, with a foot pad at one end and a retaining loop at the other. At the one touch of a button, it could telescope out to 5 or 6 times its normal length, and the internal shock-absorbing system allowed a skilled operator to perform the most amazing maneuvers. The foot pad could also become a claw or hook if necessary. There were many other refinements, but that was the basic design. It looked deceptively easy to use. It wasn't. The airlock pumps finished recycling. The exit sign came on. The outer doors opened and they drifted slowly into the void. Discovery was windmilling about 200 meters away, following them in orbit around Io, which filled half the sky. Jupiter was invisible on the other side of the satellite. This was a matter of deliberate choice. They were using Io as a shield to protect them from the energies raging back and forth in the flux tube that linked the two worlds. Even so, the radiation level was dangerously high. They had less than 15 minutes before they must get back to shelter. Almost immediately, Colonel had a problem with his suit. It fitted me when I left Earth, he complained, but now I'm rattling around inside like a pea in a pod. That's perfectly normal, Walter, said Surgeon Commander Rudinko, breaking into the radio circuit. You lost 10 kilos in hibernation, which you could very well afford to miss, and you've already put 3 of them back. Before Colonel had time to think of a suitable retort, he found himself gently but firmly jerked away from Leonov. Just relax, Walter, said Brailovsky. Don't use your thrusters. Even if you start tumbling, let me do all the work. Colonel could see the faint puffs from the younger man's backpack as its tiny jets drove them toward Discovery. With each little cloud of vapor, there came a gentle tug on the tow line, and he would start moving toward Brailovsky. But he never caught up with him before the next puff came. He felt rather like a yo-yo, now making one of its periodic comebacks on Earth, bouncing up and down on its string. There was only one safe way to approach the derelict, and that was along the axis around which it was slowly revolving. Discovery's center of rotation was approximately amidships, near the main antenna complex, and Brailovsky was heading directly toward this area with his anxious partner in tow. How will he stop both of us in time? Colonel asked himself. Discovery was now a huge, slender dumbbell, slowly flailing the entire sky ahead of them. Though it took several minutes to complete one revolution, the far ends were moving at an impressive speed. Colonel tried to ignore them and concentrate on the approaching and immobile center. I'm aiming for that, said Brailovsky. Don't try to help, and don't be surprised at anything that happens. Now, what does he mean by that? Colonel asked himself, while preparing to be as unsurprised as possible. Everything happened in about 5 seconds. Brailovsky triggered his broomstick so that it telescoped out to its full length of 4 meters and made contact with the approaching ship. The broomstick started to collapse, its internal spring absorbing Brailovsky's considerable momentum. But it did not, as Colonel had fully expected, bring him to rest beside the antenna mount. It immediately expanded again, reversing the Russian's velocity so that he was, in effect, reflected away from Discovery just as rapidly as he had approached. He flashed past Colonel, heading out into space again, only a few centimeters away. The startled American just had time to glimpse a large grin before Brailovsky shot past him. A second later, there was a jerk on the line connecting them, and a quick surge of deceleration as they shared momentum. Their opposing velocities had been neatly canceled. They were virtually at rest with respect to Discovery. Colonel had merely to reach out to the nearest handhold and drag them both in. Have you ever tried Russian roulette? He said when he had got his breath back. No, what is it? I must teach you sometime. It's almost as good as this for curing boredom. I hope you're not suggesting, Walter, that Max would do anything dangerous. Dr. Rudinkle sounded as if she was genuinely shocked, and Colonel decided it was best not to answer. Sometimes the Russians did not understand his peculiar sense of humor. You could have fooled me, he muttered under his breath, not loud enough for her to hear. Now that they were firmly attached to the hub of the windmilling ship, he was no longer conscious of its rotation, especially when he fixed his gaze upon the metal plates immediately before his eyes. The latter stretching away into the distance, running along the slender cylinder that was Discovery's main structure, was his next objective. The spherical command module at its far end seemed several light years away, though he knew perfectly well that the distance was only 50 meters. I'll go first, said Brailovsky, reeling in the slack of the line linking them together. Remember, it's downhill all the way from here. But that's no problem. You can hold on with one hand. Even at the bottom, gravity's only about a tenth G. And that's, what do you say, chicken shit. I think you mean chicken feed. And if it's all the same to you, I'm going feet first. I never liked crawling down ladders the wrong way up, even in fractional gravity. It was essential, Cornell was very well aware, to keep up this gently bantering tone, otherwise he would be simply overwhelmed by the mystery and danger of the situation. There he was, almost a billion kilometers from home, about to enter the most famous derelict in the entire history of space exploration. A media reporter had once called Discovery the Marie Celeste of space, and that was not a bad analogy. But there was also much that made his situation unique. Even if he tried to ignore the nightmare moonscape filling half the sky, there was a constant reminder of its presence at hand. Every time he touched the rungs of the ladder, his glove dislodged a thin mist of sulfur dust. Brailovsky, of course, was quite correct. The rotational gravity caused by the ship's end-over-end tumbling was easily countered. As he grew used to it, Colonel even welcomed the sense of direction it gave him. And then, quite suddenly, they had reached the big discolored sphere of Discovery's control and life support module. Only a few meters away was an emergency hatch, the very one, Colonel realized, that Bowman had entered for his final confrontation with Hal. Hope we can get in, muttered Brailovsky. Pity to come all this way and find the door locked. He scraped away the sulfur, obscuring the airlock status display panel. Dead, of course. Shall I try the controls? Won't do any harm, but nothing will happen. You're right. Well, here goes with manual. It was fascinating to watch the narrow hairline open in the curved wall and to note the little puff of vapor dispersing into space, carrying with it a scrap of paper. Was that some vital message? They would never know. It spun away, tumbling end over end without losing any of its initial spin as it disappeared against the stars. Brailovsky kept turning the manual control for what seemed a very long time before the dark, uninviting cave of the airlock was completely open. Colonel had hoped that the emergency lights, at least, might still be operating. No such luck. Your boss now, Walter. Welcome to U.S. territory. It certainly did not look very welcoming as he clambered inside, flashing the beam of his helmet, light around the interior as far as Colonel could tell. Everything was in good order. What else had he expected? He asked himself half angrily. Closing the door manually took even longer than opening it, but there was no alternative until the ship was powered up again. Just before the hatch was sealed, Colonel risked a glance at the insane panorama outside. A flickering blue lake had opened up near the equator. He was sure it had not been there a few hours earlier. Brilliant yellow flares, the characteristic color of glowing sodium, were dancing along its edges, and the whole of the nightland was veiled in the ghostly plasma discharge of one of Io's almost continuous auroras. It was the stuff of future nightmares, and as if that was not sufficient, there was one further touch worthy of a mad surrealist artist. Stabbing up into the black sky, apparently emerging directly from the fire pits of the burning moon, was an immense, curving horn, such as a doomed bullfighter might have glimpsed in the final moment of truth. The crescent of Jupiter was rising to meet Discovery and Leonov as they swept toward it along their common orbit. Part 18, Salvage. The moment that the outer hatch had closed behind them, there had been a subtle reversal of roles. Colonel was at home now, while Brailovsky was out of his element, feeling ill at ease in the labyrinth of pitch-black corridors and tunnels that was Discovery's interior. In theory, Max knew his way around the ship, but that knowledge was based only on a study of its design drawings. Colonel, on the other hand, had spent months working in Discovery's still uncompleted identical twin. He could quite literally find his way around blindfolded. Progress was made difficult because this part of the ship was designed for zero-G. Now the uncontrolled spin provided an artificial gravity, which, slight though it was, always seemed to be in the most inconvenient direction. First thing we've got to do, muttered Colonel, after sliding several meters down a corridor before he could grab a handhold, is to stop this damned spin. And we can't do that until we have power. I only hope that Dave Bowman safeguarded all systems before he abandoned ship. Are you sure he did abandon the ship? He may have intended to come back. You may be right. I don't suppose we'll ever know, if he even knew himself. They had now entered the pod bay, Discovery's space garage, which normally contained 3 of the spherical one-man modules used for activities outside the ship. Only pod number 3 remained. Number 1 had been lost in the mysterious accident that had killed Frank Poole, and number 2 with Dave Bowman, wherever he might be. The pod bay also contained 2 spaceships looking uncomfortably like decapitated corpses as they hung helmetless in their racks. It needed very little effort of the imagination, and Brailovsky was now working overtime to fill them with a whole menagerie of sinister occupants. It was unfortunate, but not altogether surprising, that Colonel's sometimes irresponsible sense of humor got the better of him at this very moment. Max, he said, in a tone of deadly seriousness, whatever happens, please don't go chasing off after the ship's cat. For a few milliseconds, Brailovsky was thrown off guard. He almost answered, I do wish you hadn't said that, Walter, but checked himself in time. That would have been too damning an admission of weakness. Instead, he replied, I'd like to meet the idiot who put that movie in our library. Katerina probably did it to test everyone's psychological balance. Anyway, you laughed your head off when we screened it last week. Berlovsky was silent. Colonel's remark was perfectly true, but that had been back in the familiar warmth and light of Leonov, among his friends, not in pitch-black, freezing derelict haunted by ghosts. Not in a pitch-black, freezing derelict haunted by ghosts. No matter how rational one was, it was all too easy to imagine some implacable alien beast prowling these corridors, seeking whom it might devour. It's all your fault, Grandma. It's all your fault. Grandma, may the Siberian tundra lie lightly on your beloved bones. I wish you hadn't filled my mind with so many of those gruesome legends. If I close my eyes, I can still see the hut of the Baba Yaga, standing in that forest clearing on its scrawny chicken legs. Enough of this nonsense. I'm a brilliant young engineer faced with the biggest technical challenge of his life, and I mustn't let my American friend know that I'm sometimes a frightened little boy. The noises did not help. There were too many of them, though they were so faint that only an experienced astronaut would have detected them against the sounds of his own suit. But to Max Brelovsky, accustomed to working in an environment of utter silence, they were distantly unnerving, even though he knew that the occasional crackling and creakings were almost certainly caused by the thermal expansion as the ship turned like a roast on a spit. Feeble though the sun was out here, there was still an appreciable temperature change between light and shade. Even his familiar spacesuit felt wrong. Not that there was pressure outside as well as in. All the forces acting on its joints were subtly altered, and he could no longer judge his movements accurately. I'm a beginner, starting my training all over again, he told himself angrily. Time to break the mood by some decisive action. Walter, I'd like to test the atmosphere. Pressure's okay. Temperature? Phew. It's 105 below zero. A nice bracing Russian winter. Anyway, the air in my suit will keep out the worst of the cold. Well, go ahead. But let me shine my light on your face so I can see if you start to turn blue. And keep talking. Berlovsky unsealed his visor and swung the faceplate upward. He flinched momentarily as icy fingers seemed to caress his cheeks, then took a cautious sniff, followed by a deeper breath. Chilly, but my lungs aren't freezing. There's a funny smell, though, stale, rotten, as if something's... Oh no! Looking suddenly pale, Berlovsky quickly snapped the faceplate shut. What's the problem? What's the trouble, Max? Colonel asked with sudden and now perfectly genuine anxiety. Berlovsky did not reply. He looked as if he was still trying to regain control of himself. Indeed, he seemed in real danger of that always horrible and sometimes fatal disaster, vomiting in a spacesuit. There was a long silence. Then Colonel said reassuringly, I get it, but I'm sure you're wrong. We know that Poole was lost in space. Bowman reported that he ejected the others after they died in hibernation, and we can be sure that he did. There can't be anyone here. Besides, it's so cold. He almost added, like a morgue, but checked himself in time. But suppose, whispered Berlovsky, just suppose Bowman managed to get back to the ship and died here. There was an even longer silence before Colonel deliberately and slowly opened his own faceplate. He winced as the freezing air bit into his lungs, then wrinkled his nose in disgust. I see what you mean, but you're letting your imagination run away with you. I'll bet you 10 to 1 that smell comes from the galley. Perhaps some meat went bad before the ship froze up, and Bowman must have been too busy to be a good housekeeper. I've known bachelor apartments that smelled as bad as this. Maybe you're right. I hope you are. Of course I am. And even if I'm not, damn it, what difference does it make? We've got a job to do, Max. If David Bowman's still here, that's not our department, is it, Katerina? There was no reply from the surgeon commander. They had gone too far inside the ship for radio to penetrate. They were indeed on their own, but Max's spirits were rapidly reviving. It was a privilege, he decided, to work with Walter. The American engineer sometimes appeared soft and easygoing, but he was totally competent and, when necessary, as hard as nails. Together, they would bring Discovery back to life, and perhaps back to Earth. Part 19, Operation Windmill. When Discovery suddenly lit up like the proverbial Christmas tree, navigation and interior lights blazing from end to end, the cheer aboard Leonov might almost have been heard across the vacuum between the two ships. It turned into an ironic groan when the lights promptly went out again. Nothing else happened for half an hour. Then the observation windows of Discovery's flight deck began to glow with the soft crimson of the emergency lights. A few minutes later, Colonel and Brailovsky could be seen moving around inside, their figures blurred by the film of sulfur dust. "Hello, Max? Walter, can you hear us?" called Tanya Orlova. Both the figures waved instantly, but made no other reply. Obviously, they were too busy to engage in casual conversation. The watchers on Leonov had to wait patiently while various lights flashed on and off. One of the three pod bay doors slowly opened and quickly closed, and the main antenna slewed around a modest 10 degrees. "Hello, Leonov," said Colonel at last. "Sorry to keep you waiting, but we've been rather busy. Here's a quick assessment. Judging from what we've seen so far, the ship's in much better shape than I feared. Hull's intact, leakage negligible, air pressure 85% nominal, quite breathable. But we'll have to do a major recycling job because it stinks to high heaven. The best news is that the power systems are okay, main reactor stable, batteries in good shape, almost all the circuit breakers were open. They jumped or been thrown by Bowman before he left, so all vital equipment's been safeguarded. But it will be a very big job checking everything before we have full power again. How long will that take, at least for the essentials system, life support, propulsion? Hard to say, Skipper. How long before we crash? Minimum present prediction is 10 days, but you know how that's changed up and down. Well, if we don't run into any major snags, we can haul Discovery up to a stable orbit away from this hellhole. Oh, I'd say inside a week. Anything you need? No, Max and I are doing fine. We're going into the carousel now to check the bearings. I want to get it running as soon as possible. Pardon me, Walter, but is that important? Gravity's convenient, but we've managed without any for quite a while. I'm not after gravity, though it will be useful to have some aboard. If we can get the carousel running again, It will mop up the ship's spin, stop its tumbling. Then we'll be able to couple our airlocks together and cut out EVAs. That will make work 100 times easier. Nice idea, Walter, but you're not going to mate my ship to that windmill. Suppose the bearing seize up and the carousel jams. That would tear us to pieces. Agreed. We'll cross that bridge when we come to it. I'll report again as soon as I can. No one had much rest for the next 2 days. By the end of that time, Colonel and Brelovsky had practically fallen asleep in their suits, but had completed their survey of discovery and found no unpleasant surprises. Both the Space Agency and the State Department were relieved by the preliminary report. It allowed them to claim with some satisfaction that Discovery was not a derelict but a temporarily decommissioned United States spacecraft. Now that task of reconditioning had to begin. Now the task of reconditioning had to begin. Once power had been restored, the next problem was the air. Even the most thorough house cleaning operation had failed to remove the stink. Colonel had been right in identifying its source as food spoiled when refrigeration had failed. He also claimed, with mock seriousness, that it was quite romantic. I've only got to close my eyes, he asserted, and I feel I'm back in an old-time whaling ship. Can you imagine what the Pequod must have smelled like? It was unanimously agreed that, after a visit to Discovery, very little effort of the imagination was required. The problem was finally solved, or at least reduced to manageable proportions, by dumping the ship's atmosphere. Fortunately, there was still enough air in the reserve tanks to replace it. One piece of very welcome news was that 90% of the propellant needed for the return journey was still available. Choosing ammonia instead of hydrogen as working fluid for the plasma drive had paid off handsomely. The more efficient hydrogen would have boiled off into space years ago, despite the insulation of the tanks and the frigid temperature outside. But almost all the ammonia had remained safely liquefied, and there was enough to get the ship back to a safe orbit around the Earth, or at least around the Moon. Checking Discovery's propeller-like spin was perhaps the most critical step in getting the ship under control. Sasha Kovalev compared Colonel and Brelovsky to Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, and expressed the hope that their windmill tilting expedition would end more successfully. Very cautiously, with many pauses for checking, power was fed to the carousel motors, and the great drum was brought up to speed, reabsorbing the spin it had long ago imparted to the ship. Discovery executed a complex series of precessions until eventually its end-over-end tumble had almost vanished. The last traces of unwanted rotation were neutralized by the altitude control jets until the two ships were floating motionlessly side by side, the squat, stocky Leonov dwarfed by the long, slender Discovery. Transfer from one to the other was now safe and easy, but Captain Orlova still refused to permit a physical link-up. Everyone agreed with this decision, for Io was coming steadily closer. They might yet have to abandon the vessel they had worked so hard to save. The fact that they now knew the reason for Discovery's mysterious orbital decay did not help in the least. Every time the ship passed between Jupiter and Io, it sliced through the invisible flux tube linking the two bodies, the electric river flowing from world to world. The resulting eddy currents induced in the ship or continually slowing it down, breaking it once every revolution. There was no way to predict the final movement. There was no way to predict the final moment of impact, for the current in the flux tube varied wildly according to Jupiter's own inscrutable laws. Sometimes there were dramatic surges of activity, accompanied by spectacular electric and auroral storms around Io. Then the ship would lose control by then the ship would lose altitude by many kilometers, at the same time becoming uncomfortably hot before their thermal control systems could readjust. This unexpected effect had scared and surprised everyone before the obvious explanation was realized. Any form of braking produces heat. Somewhere the heavy currents induced in the hulls of Leonov and Discovery turned them briefly into low powered electric furnaces. It was not surprising that some of Discovery's food supply had been ruined during the years the ship had been alternately cooked and cooled. The festering landscape of Io, before more than ever like an illustration from a medieval textbook, was only 500 kilometers away when Colonel risked activating the main drive, while Leonov stood off at a very respectful distance. There was no visible effects, none of the smoke and fire of the old-time chemical rockets, but the two ships drew slowly apart as Discovery gained speed. After a few hours of very gentle maneuvering, both ships had raised themselves 1,000 kilometers. Now there was time to relax briefly and to make plans for the next stage in the mission. "You've done a wonderful job, Walter," said Surgeon Commander Rudinko, putting her ample arm around the exhausted colonel's shoulder. "We're all proud of you." Very casually, she broke a small capsule under his nose. It was 24 hours before he woke up, annoyed and hungry. Part 20, Guillotine. "What is it?" asked Colonel with mild distaste, hefting a little mechanism in his hand. "A guillotine for mice?" "Not a bad description, but I'm after bigger game." Floyd pointed to a flashing arrow on the display screen, which was now showing a complicated circuit diagram. "You see this line?" "Yes, the main power supply." "So?" "This is the point where it enters Hal's central processing unit. I'd like you to install this gadget here, inside the cable trunking, where it can't be found without a deliberate search." "I see, a remote control. So you can pull the plug on Hal whenever you want to." "Very neat. A non-conducting blade, too, so there won't be any embarrassing shorts when it's triggered." "Who makes toys like this? The CIA?" "Never mind. The controls in my room. That little red calculator I always keep on my desk. Put in 9 nines, take the square root and press INT. That's all." "I'm not sure of its range. We'll have to test that. But as long as Leonov and Discovery are within a couple of kilometers of each other, there'll be no danger of Hal running amok again." "Who are you going to tell about this thing?" "Well, the only person I'm really hiding it from is Chandra." "I guess as much. But the fewer who know, the less likely it is to be talked about. I'll tell Tanya that it exists, and if there's an emergency, you can show her how to operate it." "What kind of emergency?" "That's not a very bright question, Walter. If I knew, I wouldn't need the damn thing." "Guess you're right. When do you want me to install your patented Hal Zapper?" "As soon as you can. Preferably tonight when Chandra's sleeping." "Are you kidding? I don't think he ever sleeps. He's like a mother nursing a sick baby." "Well, he's got to come back to Leonov to eat occasionally." "I've news for you. The last time he went across, he tied a little sack of rice to his suit. That will keep him going for weeks." Then we'll have to use one of Katerina's famous knockout drops. They did a pretty good job on you, didn't they? Colonel was joking about Chandra, at least. Floyd assumed that he was, though one could never be quite sure. He was fond of making outrageous statements with a perfectly straight face. It had been some time before the Russians had fully realized that. Soon, in self-defense, they were prone to preemptive laughs even when Colonel was being perfectly serious. Colonel's own laugh, mercifully, had much abated since Floyd had first heard it in the upward-bound shuttle. On that occasion, it had obviously been primed by alcohol. He had fully expected to cringe from it again at the end-of-orbit party when Leonov had finally made rendezvous with Discovery. But even on that occasion, though Colonel had drunk a good deal, he had remained as much under control as Captain Orlova herself. The one thing he did take seriously was his work. On the way up from Earth, he had been a passenger. Now he was crew. Part 21. Resurrection. We are, Floyd told himself, about to awaken a sleeping giant. How will Hal react to our presence after all these years? What will he remember of the past? And will he be friendly or hostile? As he floated just behind Dr. Chandra, in the zero-gravity environment of Discovery's flight deck, Floyd's mind was seldom far from the cutoff switch, installed and tested only a few hours earlier. The radio control was mere centimeters from his hand, and he felt somewhat foolish to have brought it with him. At this stage, Hal was still disconnected from all the ship's operational circuits. Even if he was reactivated, he would be a brain without limbs, though not without sense organs. He would be able to communicate, but not to act. As Colonel had put it, the worst he can do is swear at us. I'm ready for the first test, Captain, said Chandra. All the missing modules have been replaced, and I've run diagnostic programs on all circuits. Everything appears normal, at least on this level. Captain Orlova glanced at Floyd, who gave a nod. At Chandra's insistence, only the three of them were present for this critical first run, and it was quite obvious that even this small audience was unwelcome. Very well, Dr. Chandra. Ever conscious of protocol, the captain added quickly, Dr. Floyd has given his approval, and I have no objections myself. I should explain, said Chandra, in a tone that clearly conveyed disapproval, that his voice recognition and speech synthesis centers have been damaged. We'll have to teach him to speak all over again. Luckily, he learns several million times faster than a human being. The scientist's fingers danced over the keyboard as he typed out a dozen words, apparently at random, carefully pronouncing each one as it appeared on the screen. Like a distorted echo, the words came back from the speaker grill, lifeless, indeed mechanical, with no sense of any intelligence behind them. This isn't the old Hal, thought Floyd. It's no better than the primitive speaking toys that were such a novelty when I was a kid. Chandra pressed the repeat button, and the series of words sounded once again. Already there was a noticeable improvement. Though no one could have mistaken the speaker for a human being, the words I gave him once contained the basic English phonemes. The words I gave him contained the basic English phonemes. About 10 iterations, Makamats, and he'll be acceptable. But I don't have the equipment to do a really good job of therapy. Therapy? Asked Floyd. You mean that he's, well, brain damaged? No, snapped Chandra. The logic circuits are in perfect condition. Only the voice output may be defective, though it will improve steadily. So check everything against the visual display to avoid misinterpretations. And when you do speak, enunciate carefully. Floyd gave Captain Orlova a wry smile and asked the obvious question. What about all the Russian accents around here? I'm sure that won't be a problem with Captain Orlova or Dr. Kovalev, but the others, well, we'll have to run individual tests. Anyone who can't pass will have to use the keyboard. That's still looking a long way ahead. For the present, you're the only person who should attempt communication, agreed Captain. Absolutely. Only the briefest of nods revealed that Chandra had heard them. His fingers continued to fly over the keyboard, and columns of words and symbols flashed across the display screen at such a rate that no human being could possibly assimilate them. Presumably, Chandra had an eidetic memory, for he appeared to recognize whole pages of information at a glance. Floyd and Orlov were just about to leave the scientist to his arcane devotions when he suddenly acknowledged their presence again. Holding up his hand in warning or anticipation, with an almost hesitant movement in marked contrast with his previous swift actions, he slid back a locking bar and pressed a single isolated key. Instantly, with no perceptible pause, a voice came from the console, no longer in a mechanical parody of human speech. There was intelligence, consciousness, self-awareness here, though as yet only on a rudimentary level. Good morning, Dr. Chandra. This is Hal. I am ready for my first lesson. There was a moment of shocked silence. Then, acting on the same impulse, the two observers left the deck. Haywood Floyd would never have believed it. Dr. Chandra was crying.